If you had been standing on that subway platform at exactly 11:59 at night, you would have noticed the same thing everyone else eventually stopped noticing, the silence before her voice arrived. Melody Bennett always came in like a shift in weather, quiet at first, almost invisible, until the first note broke through the cold fluorescent hum of the station. Her guitar case was worn at the corners, the wood scratched from years of subway floors and borrowed hope, and she set it down like she was placing something fragile into the world that might not be returned intact. That night the air smelled like rain that never fully left New York, clinging to coats and concrete, and the distant sound of trains passing underground felt like the city breathing without rest. She adjusted the strap of her guitar, took one slow breath, and began to sing. It was not a performance meant for attention, at least not in the way people usually meant it, but something softer, something that asked only to be heard rather than praised. A few commuters slowed down, some kept walking, most pretended not to notice, but there was always a rhythm that formed around her, as if the station itself leaned in slightly to listen. 7 seconds into her second song, he arrived. Rafael Castellano never entered a space like other people did. There was no hesitation, no search for direction, no glance around to orient himself. He simply appeared at a fixed point on the platform, just beyond the yellow safety line, where the light from the overhead fixtures fractured slightly against the polished tiles. Always the same place, always the same timing, always as if he had stepped out of something already in motion. Tonight he wore the same dark coat he had worn the night before, the fabric too expensive to belong to someone who should have been standing in a subway station at midnight, and yet he stood there without distraction, without urgency, as if time had agreed to behave differently around him. Melody did not look up immediately. She rarely did at first. She had learned that most people who lingered too long were either looking for something they did not have or trying to become something they were not. But Raphael was different in a way she did not yet have words for. He did not speak, did not move closer, did not offer anything that could be mistaken for interruption. He simply listened, and always without exception. He arrived after she had already begun singing, and remained until exactly 10 seconds before she finished. That pattern should have felt accidental the first time, but it never changed. Not once in 6 weeks. Tonight a train roared through the tunnel behind her, wind pulling briefly at the loose edges of her jacket, and for a moment her voice carried differently, softer, stretched thin by the rush of air. When the train passed, the platform settled again into its usual rhythm, distant footsteps, the echo of a vending machine, the occasional coin dropping into her open guitar case. Raphael remained still, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the movement around him, but on her. There was no expression on his face that she could easily interpret, no smile, no frown, only attention so steady it felt almost architectural, like something built rather than felt. A man passing behind him slowed, glanced in his direction, then quickly looked away as if deciding not to recognize what he had just seen. Melody finished the verse she was singing and transitioned into the next without pause, her fingers moving along the strings with practiced memory rather than thought. That was when she noticed it, not him exactly, but the absence around him. People naturally avoided standing too close, even when there was space, as if something in his stillness discouraged interruption. She had never seen anyone speak to him. She had never seen anyone stand beside him for more than a passing second. He was always alone, but not in the way she understood loneliness. It was something contained, deliberate, almost chosen. For the first time that night, she allowed her eyes to drift upward as she sang, just briefly, just enough to meet the edge of the platform where he stood. Raphael was already looking at her, not at her guitar, not at the crowd, not at anything else that could have justified the attention, just her. The contact lasted only a moment before she instinctively looked back down at her strings, but it was enough to leave a strange stillness in her chest, the kind that did not belong to fear or comfort, but something unclassified, something unfamiliar. A few seconds later, as if following an invisible rule only he understood, Raphael shifted his weight slightly, glanced toward the tunnel, and stepped back just far enough to disappear into the edge of the crowd before the next train arrived. Melody finished her song, opened her eyes, and found the space where he had been standing empty again, as if he had never been there at all, except for one detail she could not ignore, the faint impression that someone had been listening more closely than anyone ever had before. And for the first time since she had begun singing in this station, she wondered if he would return again tomorrow, and when she looked down at her guitar case, there was already a folded bill placed neatly inside it that she did not remember hearing drop, The next night arrived with the same tired glow over the underground station, as if the city had not fully recovered from the day and had no intention of trying. Melody Bennett showed up earlier than usual, not because she expected anything different, but because something in her thoughts refused to settle after the previous night. The memory of a silent figure standing exactly where the light fractured on the platform kept returning between every note she played during the day, like a quiet echo she could not place. She told herself it meant nothing, that people came and went in subway stations all the time, that she was only noticing him because he had stood still long enough to feel unusual. Still, when she opened her guitar case and sat down in her usual spot, her eyes drifted almost immediately to the far end of the platform where he had been standing before. He was not there yet. The absence felt more noticeable than his presence had been. She adjusted her grip on the guitar, exhaled slowly, and began to play. The station responded in its familiar way. Some passengers slowing down, others continuing without a glance, a few dropping coins into her case without stopping their pace. Her voice carried through the open space with the same steady rhythm she had learned to rely on over months of repetition, and yet tonight she found herself listening for something beyond the sound of her own singing. 7 minutes into her set, she noticed him arrive. Rafael Castellano stepped into view from the stairwell like he had emerged from a pattern rather than a place. He did not look around, he did not pause. He simply walked to the same position he had occupied the night before and stopped. Always the same distance from the yellow line, always the same angle facing her. Melody did not react outwardly, but something in her awareness tightened slightly, as if her attention had been gently pulled in 2 directions at once. She continued singing, though her focus began to shift in ways she did not fully understand. This time he did not immediately settle into stillness. Instead, after a few seconds of watching her, Raphael reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded bill, holding it between his fingers for a moment before placing it into her guitar case with deliberate care. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet the precision of it felt different from the usual scattered donations she received. He did not throw it in. He did not hesitate. He placed it exactly as if the act itself mattered. Melody noticed, and for the first time she broke her usual rule of never letting curiosity interrupt performance. Her voice softened slightly as she reached the end of a line, and when she glanced up briefly, she saw that Raphael was already watching her. Not the crowd behind her, not the movement of commuters, but her, as if the rest of the station existed only as background noise he had learned to ignore. A train passed through the tunnel, shaking the air lightly, and when it cleared she realized he had not moved at all. He remained there, still and precise, as though waiting for something specific within the structure of her song. When she finished her set, she lowered her guitar and reached for the edge of her case, expecting the usual mix of coins and folded bills. Instead, she noticed something unusual. The small folded bill he had placed was crisp, neatly aligned with the edge of the case, different from the rest. It was not just the condition that stood out, but the consistency. She had seen him leave the same kind of bill the night before, same fold, same placement, same timing. The realization settled in her mind slowly, forming a pattern she did not yet know how to interpret. She looked up again, but Raphael had already shifted slightly away from the platform edge, his posture unchanged, his attention still directed toward her, as if he had not finished listening, even though she had stopped singing. A moment later, without any visible urgency, he turned and walked toward the stairwell leading out of the station. No glance back, no hesitation, just departure with the same controlled rhythm as his arrival. Melody watched him go, her fingers still resting lightly on her guitar strings, and for the first time she found herself wondering not why he came, but how long this pattern had been repeating before she ever noticed it. A commuter brushing past her shoulder accidentally snapped her back into the present, and she quickly returned to packing her instrument, but the thought remained. There was something structured about him, something too consistent to be coincidence. And as the station lights flickered slightly overhead, she realized she had begun to anticipate his presence more than she was willing to admit, even to herself, and somewhere beyond the edge of the platform, unseen and already distant. Rafael Castellano continued walking as if he had only come to confirm that she would still be there when he returned again. The third night felt different even before Melody Bennett stepped onto the subway platform, as if the air itself carried a quieter kind of expectation. She could not explain why she felt earlier than usual again, only that something in her routine had begun to shift without her permission. The city above was still awake when she descended the stairs. But down here everything felt paused, suspended between departures and arrivals that never fully belonged to anyone. She adjusted the strap of her guitar case and walked to her usual spot, but before she even opened the case, her eyes moved instinctively toward the far end of the platform. He was already there. Rafael Castellano stood exactly where he had stood the night before, but this time there was a slight difference in how he held himself, as if the waiting had become more intentional than routine. He was not looking at the tracks, not looking at the crowd, but directly at the space where she would soon begin to sing. Melody hesitated for only a second before setting down her case. She told herself it meant nothing that he arrived early. People had habits. Commuters, workers, even strangers in passing could repeat patterns without meaning, but Raphael did not look like someone who repeated anything without purpose. He looked like someone who chose every detail carefully and then allowed the world to adjust around it. When she began to play, her voice carried into the station with its usual calm strength, but tonight she noticed something new in the way the sound returned to her. The station felt less empty than before, not because more people had arrived, but because one presence seemed to anchor the space in a way she could not ignore. Raphael did not move. He did not reach for anything, did not shift his weight, did not look away even once. It was as if the song created a boundary he refused to cross or break. Halfway through her second verse, a commuter bumped into a metal column nearby, the sharp sound briefly echoing through the platform. A few heads turned, then returned to their usual indifference. But Raphael did not react at all. His attention never left her. That was when Melody noticed something else. A second man stood farther back near the stairwell, dressed too neatly for the subway, positioned in a way that suggested he was not waiting for a train. He was watching Raphael, not her. Raphael, the realization made her voice falter for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, finishing the line without interruption. She did not know why she noticed it. Only that something about the balance of attention in the station felt wrong in a way she could not yet define. Raphael finally shifted his gaze slightly, just enough to acknowledge something beyond her for the first time. The man near the stairs gave a subtle nod and then disappeared upward without approaching the platform. No exchange, no words, only recognition. Melody watched the movement from the corner of her eye but forced herself to continue singing. When the song ended, she lowered her guitar and exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle into her shoulders. She reached into her guitar case expecting the usual scattered coins and folded bills, but again she found something identical to the night before. A single folded bill placed with precise alignment, identical in shape, identical in placement, as if someone had rehearsed the act before performing it. She looked up instinctively. Raphael was still there. He had not moved closer, but something about his posture had changed slightly, as if he had completed a thought rather than a task. For a brief moment their eyes met again, longer than before. Not long enough to feel like conversation, but long enough for Melody to feel the strange pressure of being acknowledged without being approached. Then, as if following the same invisible timing she had begun to associate with him, Raphael turned away. He walked toward the exit stairs at a steady pace, neither hurried nor slow, disappearing into the flow of commuters as if he had never been the focal point of the entire platform. Melody remained seated for a moment longer than usual after he left. The station returned to its normal rhythm, but something in her attention did not. She glanced once more at the folded bill in her case, then closed it carefully. As she stood to leave, she noticed something she had not seen before. On the far edge of the platform, partially hidden behind a column, a small dark mark on the floor suggested where someone had stood for a long time without moving, not recent enough to be obvious, but not old enough to be ignored. She paused for a second, then looked back toward the stairs Raphael had taken. He was gone, but the feeling that he had not simply come and left remained, stronger than before. As she walked up toward the street level, she could not shake the sense that the pattern she had begun to notice was not something she had discovered, but something she had finally been allowed to see. The fourth night arrived with a strange kind of quiet confidence, as if the subway station itself had begun to remember Melody Bennett. She noticed it the moment she stepped down the stairs, not in anything visible, but in the way her thoughts no longer questioned whether she would see him. The question had changed without her noticing. It was no longer if he would come, but when. The platform was moderately busy, commuters moving in small clusters, phones glowing in their hands, conversations fragmented and brief. She walked to her usual corner and set down her guitar case, but this time she hesitated before opening it. Her gaze moved immediately to the far end of the platform. He was already there. Rafael Castellano stood in the same position as always, but tonight there was something different in the stillness around him. The air near him felt slightly more structured, as if the space itself had learned his presence and adjusted accordingly. Melody did not understand why that thought came to her, only that it felt accurate in a way she could not explain. She began to play, her fingers moving through familiar chords, but her attention kept slipping toward him between verses. Rafael was not watching the crowd, not reacting to movement, not distracted by anything around him. His entire focus remained fixed on her, and for the first time she noticed that his expression was not as unreadable as she had assumed. There was something in it that resembled patience, but not the kind she associated with waiting. It felt more like endurance, as if he had been doing this longer than she had ever been aware of. A train arrived on the opposite track, shaking the platform slightly, and for a moment the lights flickered overhead. When the noise settled, Melody saw something new. Rafael had shifted slightly closer to the yellow line than before. It was a small change, no more than a few inches, but it broke the pattern she had begun to unconsciously track. She continued singing, but her focus tightened. She tried to ignore it, but her awareness kept returning to him. He had never moved before, not once in the previous nights. When she finished her second song, she lowered her guitar and instinctively reached for her case. The usual coins and folded bills were there, but this time she noticed something else immediately. The folded bill placed inside was accompanied by a second identical one, positioned with the same precise alignment as if the act had been repeated twice for confirmation. She froze for a second longer than usual, her fingers hovering over the edge of the case. This was the first variation she had seen, not in amount, but in repetition. When she looked up, Rafael was still watching her, but now he was not alone. Two figures stood farther back along the platform, both dressed in dark coats that blended into the movement of commuters. They were not interacting with anyone. They were observing. One of them shifted slightly, speaking into something near his collar before returning to stillness. Melody felt a subtle tightening in her chest, though she could not explain why. Nothing about the situation was openly threatening, nothing loud or direct, but there was a structure forming around the platform that she could no longer ignore. Rafael finally moved his gaze away from her for the first time since she had started playing. It lasted only a second, directed toward the two distant figures, but it changed the atmosphere around him. The men immediately adjusted their positions, stepping back into the flow of commuters as if dissolving into the crowd. No confrontation occurred, no visible exchange, yet the response was immediate and precise. Melody noticed it, even if she did not understand it. She finished her set shortly after, her voice steady but quieter than usual. When she closed her guitar case, she paused before standing. Rafael had not moved, not yet, but something in his posture suggested he would, and for the first time she realized she was waiting for it. A moment later he turned, not toward her, not toward the tracks, but toward the exit. As he walked away, his pace was unchanged, but the distance between him and the platform felt more final than before, as if something had been acknowledged without words. Melody remained seated after he left, her hand resting on the closed case. The folded bills inside felt heavier than they should have. She glanced once more toward the empty space where he had been standing. The pattern was still there, but now it had edges she could not yet see clearly, and as she finally stood to leave, she could not shake the feeling that the platform was no longer simply a place where she performed, but a place where something had begun to observe her in return. The fifth night began with rain that never fully committed to falling, the kind that hung in the air like hesitation, coating the city in a soft grey blur. Melody Bennett noticed it as she descended into the subway station, the dampness already clinging to her coat before she even reached the platform. Something about the evening felt heavier than the others, not in sound or crowd, but in expectation. She no longer asked herself if he would appear. That question had already settled into certainty. When she reached her usual corner, she paused for a fraction of a second before setting her guitar case down. The platform was busier than usual, commuters shifting between trains, footsteps echoing in uneven rhythm. She opened her case slowly, her fingers slightly colder than normal, and looked instinctively toward the far end of the platform. He was there. Rafael Castellano stood in the same position as always, but tonight there was something different in how he was framed by the light. The overhead fixtures above him flickered once, then stabilized, casting him in a sharper outline than before. For a brief moment, Melody felt as if the space around him had become more defined than the rest of the station, as though everything else had softened in comparison. She began to sing, but her attention was divided from the first note. Raphael was no longer alone. Two figures stood farther back near the stairwell, dressed in dark coats that blended too perfectly with the crowd. They were not looking at her. They were watching him. She noticed it almost immediately, and a subtle tension formed in her chest that she could not explain. Raphael did not acknowledge them at first. His attention remained fixed on her, as it always did, steady and unbroken. But there was a slight shift in his posture that suggested awareness beyond what she could see. When she reached the midpoint of her set, one of the figures near the stairwell adjusted their position, speaking briefly into something hidden near their collar. Raphael's gaze flicked once in their direction, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but the response was immediate. Both figures turned slightly and moved into the flow of commuters, disappearing without urgency, as if they had never been separate from the crowd at all. Melody continued singing, but her voice felt more contained now, as if she was performing within a space that had subtly changed shape. When she finished her final song, she lowered her guitar and reached into her case. The familiar folded bills were there, placed with the same precise care she had begun to associate with him, but this time there was something else. A second layer beneath the first, as if the placement had been adjusted after the fact. It was subtle, but enough to disrupt the pattern she had started to rely on. She hesitated, her fingers resting on the edge of the case, before slowly looking up. Raphael was still standing there, but now he was no longer watching her. For the first time since she had begun noticing him, his attention was directed fully away from the performance. He was observing the movement of the station, the exits, the flow of people, with a level of precision that felt unfamiliar compared to his usual stillness. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he turned and began walking toward the stairs. There was no pause, no final glance, no deviation from his usual departure. But this time, Melody did not immediately look away. She watched him leave longer than she had before, her hand still resting on her guitar case. Something in the rhythm of the night had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that she could feel it lingering in the space he had just occupied. As the crowd resumed its normal flow and the station returned to its usual noise, she noticed something on the ground near where he had stood. A faint mark, barely noticeable, as if someone had remained in one place for too long without moving. She stared at it for a moment longer than she intended, then closed her guitar case with slow hands. When she finally stood to leave, she realized she was no longer thinking about whether he would come again. She was wondering what would happen when the pattern finally changed. The sixth night arrived without announcement, as if the city had simply decided to continue breathing without pause and without permission. Melody Bennett noticed the change in herself before she noticed anything else, a quiet anticipation that had begun to sit somewhere between habit and curiosity. She no longer descended into the subway station, wondering whether she would see him. That uncertainty had already dissolved into something more complicated, something closer to expectation. When she stepped onto the platform, the air felt slightly different. Not warmer or colder, but more structured, as if the space had begun to organize itself around an unseen center. She walked to her usual corner and placed her guitar case down, her movements slower than before, and for a brief moment she did not look up immediately. She let herself wait. When she finally lifted her gaze, he was already there. Rafael Castellano stood in his usual position, but tonight the platform felt quieter around him despite the presence of commuters. It was not that fewer people were present, but that their attention seemed less anchored, as if something about the space encouraged distance without explanation. Melody began to play, her voice steady but more restrained than usual, and as the song unfolded, she noticed something she had not seen before. Raphael was no longer entirely still. He had shifted slightly, just enough to face a different angle of the platform, his attention no longer solely fixed on her but also extending outward, tracking movement in a way that felt deliberate rather than casual. For the first time, Melody became aware that his presence did not exist in isolation. There were patterns around him she had never noticed before. Two commuters near the stairwell lingered longer than necessary. Another figure stood near the far exit, not moving with the flow of people. They did not interact, but their positioning felt intentional, as if they were placed rather than simply present. Melody's voice continued, but a quiet tension formed in her awareness. Raphael remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in how he occupied space, a sense that he was no longer just observing her performance, but also maintaining awareness of everything surrounding it. When she finished her second song, she lowered her guitar slightly. her fingers still resting on the strings, and reached for her case. The folded bills were there as always, precise, unchanged in form, but this time she noticed something else. A second set of bills placed slightly offset from the first, not disordered, but adjusted with intention, as if the placement had been corrected after observation. She paused longer than usual. When she looked up, Raphael was still there, but his attention had shifted fully toward the far end of the platform. One of the figures near the exit turned away and left at the exact moment he looked in their direction. No visible exchange occurred, no movement beyond the ordinary, but the timing was exact enough to feel coordinated. Melody closed her guitar case slowly, her mind beginning to register a pattern that no longer felt accidental. Raphael had never once spoken to her beyond brief acknowledgements she could count on one hand, and yet his presence now seemed connected to more than just her performance. The space around him functioned differently when he was present, as if certain actions only occurred because he was there to observe them. As she stood to leave, she noticed Raphael finally move. He stepped back from the platform edge, not toward her, not toward the exit immediately, but toward a point where the light was dimmer, less defined. For a brief moment he looked in her direction again, not directly at her face, but at the space she had just occupied. Then he turned and walked away. The departure felt no different from previous nights, but something about the timing no longer aligned with the simplicity she had once assumed. Melody remained standing for a moment after he disappeared, her guitar case hanging from her hand. The station returned to its usual rhythm, trains passing, footsteps echoing, voices overlapping without meaning, but she no longer experienced it the same way. Something had been added to the pattern she could not yet name, and as she finally turned toward the stairs, she realized that what she had been observing for 6 nights was no longer just a man watching her sing, but a structure of attention she had only just begun to notice. The 7th night did not feel like a continuation of the others. It felt like a deviation, as if something that had been repeating with careful precision had finally introduced an imperfection. Melody Bennett noticed it the moment she stepped into the subway station. The air was heavier, not physically, but in the way her attention kept pausing on details that had never mattered before. Commuters moved faster than usual, voices sharper, footsteps more fragmented, as if the station itself was slightly unsettled. She walked toward her usual corner, her guitar case feeling heavier than it should have, and for the first time in 7 nights she did not immediately look toward the far end of the platform. She hesitated. When she finally looked up, Rafael Castellano was already there, but something about his presence was different. He was not standing in the exact position she had come to recognize. He was closer to the center of the platform, just beyond the flow of commuters, and his posture was no longer purely observational. It was alert. Melody felt a subtle tightening in her chest that she could not explain. She set her guitar case down slowly and began to play, but her voice carried less certainty than before. The familiar rhythm of performance felt slightly misaligned, as if she was singing within a space that had shifted without warning. Raphael was still watching her, but now his attention was divided. Not distracted, but distributed, as if he was tracking more than just her movement. 2 figures stood near the far stairwell again, but this time there were more. 3, possibly 4, each positioned in ways that felt unintentional at first glance, but increasingly structured when observed for longer than a few seconds. Melody noticed one of them glance briefly toward Raphael before stepping away from the platform entirely. Another followed within moments. No words were exchanged, no visible signals given, but the departures were coordinated enough to create a subtle imbalance in the space. She continued singing, but her awareness no longer stayed fully within the music. Something had changed in the way Raphael occupied the platform. He was no longer simply present at a fixed point. He was central to the movement of everything around him. When she finished her second song, she lowered her guitar and reached for her case, but this time she hesitated longer than usual before opening it. The folded bills were there, placed with the same precision she had come to expect, but now there was an additional detail. One of the bills was no longer aligned with the others. It was angled slightly, as if placed in a hurry or adjusted after the fact. Melody stared at it longer than she intended. When she finally looked up, Raphael was not watching her anymore. His gaze was directed toward the stairwell. One of the figures standing there met his gaze for only a moment before turning away and disappearing into the flow of commuters. Another followed almost immediately after. No confrontation, no visible exchange, only disappearance. Melody closed her guitar case slowly. her fingers lingering on the latch. For the first time, she felt the structure she had been sensing begin to reveal its edges. It was not just repetition anymore, it was coordination. Raphael finally moved. He stepped forward slightly, then stopped, as if confirming something only he could see. His attention returned to her for a brief moment, but it no longer felt like observation alone. It felt like acknowledgement of something that had been unfolding beyond her awareness. Then, without hesitation, he turned and walked toward the exit stairs. His departure was the same as always, in motion, controlled, unbroken. But tonight, Melody did not immediately look away. She remained standing for several seconds after he disappeared, her hand still resting on her guitar case. The station resumed its usual rhythm almost instantly, commuters reclaiming space, trains approaching in the distance, announcements echoing through the tunnels. Yet something remained suspended in her perception, a lingering awareness that the pattern she had been watching was no longer just about presence and absence. It was about something moving through the station every night that she had only just begun to see clearly. The eighth night arrived with a different kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of certainty. Melody Bennett felt it the moment she stepped below street level, as if the subway station had stopped behaving like a place and started behaving like a system with rules she did not fully understand. The usual noise was still there, trains in the distance, scattered footsteps, the low hum of overhead lights, but everything felt slightly displaced, as if each sound belonged one step out of sync with the world. She walked to her usual corner without hesitation, yet something in her movement felt slower, more aware. When she placed her guitar case down, she did not immediately look up. She allowed herself a breath longer than usual, then lifted her gaze. Rafael Castellano was there, but tonight everything about his presence carried a subtle difference that she could not ignore. He was no longer positioned at the far edge of the platform. He stood closer than before, just outside the main flow of commuters, where the light from the overhead fixtures softened into a faint gradient across the floor. His posture remained composed, but there was a stillness around him that no longer felt passive. It felt maintained, as if he was holding something in place by simply being there. Melody began to play, but her voice entered the space differently this time. Not weaker, not stronger, but more aware of its own presence, as if she could feel how sound traveled toward him and returned in ways she had not noticed before. Raphael was watching her, but not in isolation. For the first time, she noticed that his attention seemed to extend beyond her and into the surrounding movement of the station. People passed between them more frequently now, yet there was an odd consistency in how certain individuals never stayed in one place for long. One man near the stairwell checked his phone, then left without boarding any train. Another stood too long near a column before walking away without purpose. Melody noticed these patterns without fully understanding why they stood out to her now when they had not before. Midway through her set, a train entered the station, its wind briefly disrupting the edges of her sound. When it passed, she saw Raphael shift slightly, his gaze moving not to her, but toward the far exit. Two of the lingering figures responded almost immediately, one stepping away, the other disappearing into the crowd without urgency. The coordination was subtle, almost invisible if not observed carefully, but once noticed it could not be unseen. Melody's fingers slowed slightly on the strings before she corrected herself and continued. She finished her set without interruption, but her attention no longer rested fully within the performance. When she closed her guitar case, she paused longer than usual before reaching for the latch. The folded bills were there as expected, but now there was a change she had not seen before. One of them had been replaced with a different fold, tighter, more precise, as if it had been restructured after observation rather than placement. Her hand lingered for a moment as she studied it. When she looked up, Raphael was no longer watching her. His attention was directed toward the stairwell again, but this time there was no movement from the figures that had been there before. They were gone, no departure was visible, no transition observed, only absence. Melody closed her guitar case slowly, the sound of the latch clicking shut louder than it should have been in her awareness. Raphael finally moved. He took one step back from the platform edge, then another, not hurried, not delayed, but measured in a way that felt more final than before. His gaze returned to her briefly, not as observation but as confirmation. Then he turned and walked toward the exit stairs. This time, Melody did not immediately look away. She remained standing longer than usual, her guitar case hanging at her side, while the station resumed its natural rhythm around her. Commuters moved again, trains arrived and departed, announcements echoed through the tunnels, yet the space he had occupied did not feel empty in the same way it had on previous nights. It felt accounted for, as if his absence was part of a structure that remained even when he was not present. As she finally turned to leave, she realized something that unsettled her more than anything before. The pattern she had been witnessing was no longer just about a man who came to listen to music. It was about a system of attention that only revealed itself when she stopped assuming she was alone within it. The ninth night began with a different weight in the air, not heavier in sound, but heavier in meaning, as if something that had been slowly building beneath the surface of repetition was finally beginning to press upward into visibility. Melody Bennett felt it before she even reached the subway platform. Her steps slowed slightly as she descended the stairs, her grip on the guitar case tighter than usual, though she could not explain why. The station looked the same as always, fluorescent lights humming softly, scattered commuters moving between platforms, trains arriving and departing in distant echoes. But something about the space felt less like a place she was entering and more like a pattern she was stepping into. She walked to her usual corner and set down her case. But this time she did not immediately look toward the far end of the platform. Instead, she allowed her attention to settle into the surrounding space first. It was only after a few seconds that she lifted her gaze. Rafael Castellano was not in his usual position. That alone made her pause longer than she intended. He was there, but not where she had come to expect him. He stood closer to the central flow of the platform, partially aligned with the movement of commuters rather than separated from it. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time, he did not feel anchored to a fixed point. He felt integrated into the structure of movement itself. Melody began to play, but her focus shifted almost immediately. The absence of his usual position created a kind of imbalance that she could not ignore. Raphael was still watching her, but his attention was no longer singular. It moved, not physically, but perceptibly, as if he was tracking more than just her performance. Several commuters passed between them, but she noticed something she had not fully registered before. People who had previously lingered near the platform edges were no longer present. The stairwell was clear. The usual figures who had stood too long, watched too carefully, or disappeared too quickly were gone. The change was not abrupt, but it was absolute. Melody continued singing, but her voice felt slightly more exposed, as if the structure that had quietly surrounded her in previous nights had shifted without warning. Raphael remained still, but there was a new quality in how he occupied the space. He no longer seemed to be observing the station as a passive environment. He appeared to be measuring it. Every movement around him, every arrival and departure, seemed to register in his awareness in a way that suggested alignment rather than randomness. When she reached the end of her set, Melody lowered her guitar and reached into her case as usual, but hesitated before opening it fully. The folded bills were there, but this time they were arranged differently, not just in alignment, but in separation. Each bill was placed with intentional spacing, as if marking intervals rather than offering payment. She stared at them longer than she had ever allowed herself before. When she finally looked up, Raphael was no longer watching her directly. His attention was directed toward the far end of the platform, where the stairwell descended into shadow. There was no visible movement there now, but something in his stillness suggested confirmation rather than uncertainty. A few seconds later, he turned slightly, not toward her, but toward the exit path. Melody closed her guitar case slowly, the sound of the latch echoing more sharply in her awareness than usual. She remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes drifting once more toward the space he had been watching. It felt empty, but not unoccupied. The difference was subtle, but it stayed with her as she finally stood. Raphael began walking toward the exit stairs, his pace unchanged, his presence dissolving into the movement of commuters as he had done every night before. Yet this time, Melody did not immediately return to her routine of departure. She stood for several seconds longer, her gaze lingering on the stairwell. Something about the night felt restructured, not disrupted, but reorganized. As she finally turned away and began walking toward the station exit, she realized that the pattern she had been following for 9 nights was no longer centered on whether he would arrive or leave. It was centered on everything else that moved only when he was present to allow it. The 10th night arrived with a stillness that felt less like quiet and more like anticipation that had settled into the bones of the city itself. Melody Bennett noticed it immediately as she descended the subway stairs, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights above her head, now carrying a subtle tension she could not explain. The platform looked unchanged at first glance, commuters moving in scattered patterns, announcements echoing through the tunnels, distant trains arriving and leaving without pause. But for Melody, something had shifted in how she perceived it. The space no longer felt like a backdrop. It felt like a system in which she had learned only a fraction of the rules. She walked to her usual corner, placed her guitar case down, and for the first time in 10 nights she did not immediately look toward the far end of the platform. Instead, she waited. When she finally lifted her gaze, Rafael Castellano was already there. But something about his presence immediately told her that tonight was not like the others. He stood in his usual general area, but his posture was more closed, more contained, as if the space around him had narrowed rather than expanded. The distance between him and the flow of commuters felt reduced, yet paradoxically more controlled. Melody began to play, but her attention was no longer divided between music and curiosity alone. There was something heavier in the atmosphere now, a sense that the pattern she had been observing was reaching a point of exposure. Raphael was still watching her, but his attention was not passive. It felt anchored, deliberate, and more focused than before. When a train arrived, the wind rushing through the platform briefly disrupted her hair and the edge of her jacket, but when it passed, she noticed something that made her hands tighten slightly on her guitar. Raphael had not moved, not in response to the train, not in response to the crowd, not even in response to the subtle shifts of people around him. Instead, he was watching a single direction with sustained attention, toward the stairwell that led up to the street level. For the first time, Melody noticed that there were no lingering figures near the edges of the platform. No one standing too long, no one observing too closely, no one breaking the rhythm of ordinary commuter movement. The absence felt intentional rather than coincidental. She continued singing, but her awareness had fully shifted now. The structure she had begun to sense over the previous nights was no longer subtle. It was becoming defined by what was missing as much as what was present. When she finished her set, she lowered her guitar and reached for her case, but paused before opening it. The folded bills were there as always, but their arrangement was different again. This time they were not separated or adjusted. They were aligned in a perfect, uninterrupted sequence, as if all previous variations had been corrected. She stared at them for a moment longer than she intended. When she looked up, Raphael was still facing the stairwell. There was no movement around him. The station felt unusually stable, as if all variables had been temporarily reduced. A few seconds later, he turned his head slightly, not toward her, but toward the far end of the platform, where the train tunnels disappeared into darkness. Then, for the first time in 10 nights, he did not immediately leave. Instead, he remained standing in place longer than usual, as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Melody closed her guitar case slowly, the sound of the latch echoing faintly in her awareness. She did not stand immediately. Something about the moment felt suspended, as if the usual rhythm of departure had been interrupted without announcement. When she finally stood, Raphael finally moved, but not toward the exit. He stepped closer to the center of the platform, then stopped, his attention still directed toward the stairwell above. Only after several seconds did he turn and begin walking away. His departure was the same as always in motion, controlled, precise, unbroken. But this time, Melody remained standing longer than she had on any previous night. The platform around her resumed its normal rhythm almost immediately, commuters moving, announcements continuing, trains arriving and departing in steady intervals. Yet she no longer experienced the space as neutral. Something had been removed from it, or perhaps something had been revealed through absence rather than presence. As she finally turned toward the stairs to leave, she realized that what she had been following was no longer just a man who appeared at midnight. It was a structure that only became visible when every other distraction was deliberately cleared away, leaving only the space where attention was meant to exist. The 11th night did not begin with the usual sense of repetition. It began with absence. Melody Bennett noticed it the moment she stepped down into the subway station, not because anything was missing visually, but because something fundamental in the rhythm of her expectation had shifted. The platform felt quieter than it should have been at that hour, not in sound, but in structure, as if certain invisible patterns that had existed for the past 10 nights had been temporarily removed. She walked more slowly than usual to her corner, her guitar case held tightly in her hand, and for the first time in a long while, she did not immediately look toward the far end of the platform. She already knew something was different. When she finally lifted her gaze, Rafael Castellano was not standing in his usual position. The space where he typically appeared remained occupied only by movement, commuters passing through, trains arriving and departing, nothing fixed, nothing anchored. For a moment she simply stood still, her fingers tightening slightly on the handle of her guitar case. The absence felt heavier than his presence had ever been. She told herself it was logical. People did not appear every night without variation. Schedules changed. Patterns broke. But the thought did not settle easily. She set her case down, opened it slowly, and began to play, but her voice carried a subtle hesitation she had not felt before. The station responded as it always did, indifferent yet receptive, but her attention kept drifting toward the empty space where he usually stood. 7 minutes into her set, she noticed movement at the top of the stairwell. Rafael Castellano did not enter the platform in the same way he had before. There was no immediate stillness, no fixed position. Instead, he paused briefly at the top of the stairs, observing the platform from above for a few seconds before descending. When he reached the platform floor, he did not walk to his usual position. He stopped halfway between the stairwell and the center, closer than he had ever been, yet not fully committed to either presence or absence. Melody continued playing, but her awareness tightened immediately. There was something different in how Rafael carried himself tonight. It was not simply posture or location. It was the absence of routine. When he finally settled into stillness, it was not the stillness of observation she had come to recognize. It felt more like confirmation, as if something he had been tracking had finally aligned. For the first time in 11 nights, there were no other lingering figures on the platform, no one standing near columns, no one watching from stairwells, no one occupying space without purpose. The absence of them felt deliberate rather than accidental. Melody finished her song, her fingers slowing slightly before she forced herself to complete the final note. She lowered her guitar and reached for her case, but paused when she noticed something unfamiliar. The folded bills inside were no longer placed in sequence or alignment. Instead, there was a single envelope, plain, unmarked, positioned carefully at the center of the case. She stared at it longer than she intended. When she looked up, Rafael was already watching her. Not the crowd, not the platform, but directly at her. This time, there was no ambiguity in his attention. It was complete. She hesitated before opening the case fully, but did not touch the envelope. Instead, she slowly stood, still holding her guitar. The station around them continued its movement, but it felt distant, almost irrelevant. Rafael took a step forward for the first time since she had begun noticing him, not toward her fully, but enough to break the boundary he had never crossed before. He stopped again after that single step. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. The words were not loud, but they carried clearly through the platform noise. Melody could not hear every detail at first, only enough to understand that he was addressing her directly for the first time in 11 nights. She did not respond immediately. Her mind struggled to align the moment with everything she had observed before. The pattern, the timing, the silence, all of it had led to something that no longer behaved like repetition. It behaved like decision. Rafael did not repeat himself. He simply waited. The space between them felt different now, not empty but defined. Melody finally tightened her grip on her guitar case, her voice quiet when she responded, though her words were lost partially in the sound of a train approaching in the distance. When the noise passed, Rafael was still there, still watching, still waiting. The folded envelope remained untouched in her case, and for the first time since she had started singing in the subway, Melody understood that the man who came every night was no longer just observing her. He was no longer repeating anything. He was choosing. The 12th night arrived with a stillness that felt heavier than anything Melody Bennett had experienced before. It was not silence, not absence, but completion. As if something that had been unfolding in fragments over many nights had finally reached a state where it could no longer remain hidden. She felt it the moment she stepped down into the subway station. The air seemed unchanged. The lights still flickered in their familiar rhythm, and commuters still moved in their usual scattered patterns, but none of it registered in the same way anymore. Everything felt secondary, as if the real structure of the night existed beneath what was visible. She walked to her corner slowly, her guitar case feeling more grounded in her hand than usual, and for the first time she did not look toward the far end of the platform immediately. She already knew he would be there. When she finally lifted her gaze, Rafael Castellano stood closer than he ever had before. Not at the far edge, not near the stairwell, but within the central space of the platform where movement usually passed through uninterrupted. His presence no longer felt like observation from a distance. It felt like arrival. Melody did not begin to play right away. Instead, she stood still for a moment longer than usual, her awareness fully fixed on him. There was no longer any ambiguity in how he looked at her. The distance that had defined every previous night was gone, not physically, but conceptually. Rafael was no longer part of the background of her performance. He was part of the moment itself. When she finally began to sing, her voice carried differently through the station, not louder, not softer, but fully acknowledged, as if the space around her had accepted its role in what was happening. Rafael did not move while she performed. He did not shift his gaze. But there was something in his stillness that felt no longer like waiting and more like acceptance. When she finished her set, she lowered her guitar slowly, her fingers resting longer than usual on the strings before she reached for her case. The folded envelope was still there, exactly where she had seen it the night before. She stared at it for a moment without opening it. When she looked up, Rafael was already watching her. This time there was no distance between intention and recognition. He took one step forward, then another, closing the space between them in a way that felt final rather than gradual. He stopped within a few feet of her, close enough that the usual boundary of the platform no longer felt relevant. Melody did not step back. Not because she was unafraid, but because that suggested threat or urgency. It felt deliberate in a different way, as if every night before this had been preparation for this exact distance. Rafael spoke again. This time, his voice was clearer, no longer partially lost in the sound of the station. He did not explain everything. He did not need to. The way he said her name carried the weight of all the nights he had stood at a distance without speaking. Melody listened without interrupting, her grip tightening slightly on her guitar case. Around them, the station continued to function, trains arriving and departing, announcements echoing through tunnels, commuters moving past without fully noticing what had changed at the center of the platform. But for Melody, none of it registered anymore in the same way. The structure she had been sensing for 12 nights was no longer just presence or absence, pattern or repetition. It had become choice made visible. When Rafael finished speaking, he did not move immediately. He waited, not for a response that would complete anything, but for acknowledgement that what had existed between them up to this point was no longer undefined. Melody finally looked down at the envelope in her case. She did not open it. Instead, she closed the case slowly, the sound of the latch final and quiet in her awareness. When she looked back up, Rafael was still there, still waiting, but no longer at a distance that required interpretation. The space between them no longer felt like uncertainty. It felt like a decision that had already been made and simply not yet spoken aloud. And as the station continued to move around them, unchanged and unaware, Melody understood that the nights of observation had ended, and what remained was no longer pattern but consequence. The 13th night arrived without hesitation, as if the city had already accepted that something within its underground rhythm had permanently changed. Melody Bennett felt it the moment she stepped down the subway stairs. There was no anticipation anymore, no uncertainty, no quiet questioning of whether he would appear. The pattern had already resolved itself into something final, something that no longer required repetition to be understood. The station looked the same as always, fluorescent lights humming softly, commuters moving in familiar streams, trains arriving and departing in distant echoes that blended into the background of her awareness. But for Melody, none of it carried the same weight anymore. She walked to her usual corner, but this time she did not set her guitar case down immediately. She stood for a moment, holding it at her side, and looked toward the far end of the platform. Rafael Castellano was already there, but tonight, everything about his presence felt different in a way that was no longer subtle. He was not positioned at a distance, not standing apart from the movement of the station, not observing from the edge. He was there, fully present within the space she occupied, as if the separation that had defined every previous night had finally been removed. Melody lowered her guitar case slowly and placed it on the ground, but she did not open it. She did not need to. When she began to sing, her voice carried into the station without hesitation, steady and clear, not shaped by curiosity or uncertainty, but by awareness. Raphael did not move, he did not need to. His presence was no longer defined by distance or timing, it was defined by continuity. He stood within the same space as her performance, not as an observer outside of it, but as someone who had become part of its existence. The station around them continued to function as it always had, commuters passing, trains arriving, announcements echoing through tunnels, but none of it disrupted the center of what was happening. When Melody finished her final set, she lowered her guitar and exhaled slowly, her hands resting longer than usual on the instrument before she reached for her case. The envelope was still there. She did not open it. Instead, she closed the case gently and remained standing. Raphael finally moved closer, not in steps that shortened distance, but in a way that removed the need for it entirely. He stood in front of her now, not above, not beyond, not separate from the space she occupied. For the first time since she had begun singing in the subway, there was no ambiguity left between them. He spoke her name, and this time there was no hesitation in how it reached her. Melody did not respond immediately. She looked at him, not searching for explanation, not waiting for clarification, but recognizing the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The nights of silence, the patterns, the presence, the absence. All of it had converged into something that no longer required interpretation. Around them, the station continued its movement, but it felt distant now, almost irrelevant. The only space that mattered was the one between them, and even that no longer felt like separation. Raphael did not ask anything further. He did not need to. Melody finally placed her hand on the closed guitar case beside her, not as a gesture of leaving or staying, but as acknowledgement of choice. She looked at him one last time, and in that moment there was no longer a performer and no longer an observer, no longer a pattern and no longer a deviation from it. Only recognition. When she turned slightly toward the stairs, Raphael did not stop her. When he followed a step behind, she did not look back immediately. They walked together through the station, not as distance collapsing or roles reversing, but as something that had finally resolved itself into presence without question. Above them, the city continued exactly as it always had, unaware that beneath it, something that began with a voice in the dark had become something that no longer needed the night to continue.